Across the United States, a disturbing pattern has emerged over recent years, one that strikes at the very heart of trust within Jehovah's Witnesses congregations. We're not talking about rumors spread by external critics or theoretical complaints. These are documented cases, investigated by state prosecutors, covered by respected journalists, and corroborated by victims who finally found courage to speak after decades of enforced silence. What makes these scandals particularly devastating is their origin. They don't come from the margins of the organization but from its leadership core. We're talking about elders, administrators, and members of judicial committees, the very individuals presented to congregations as spiritual guardians and moral exemplars. Consider these recent revelations that have shaken the foundation of the organization. In 2025, Joseph Fitzgerald Hall, an administrator within the Jehovah's Witnesses organization in the United States, formally confessed to sexually abusing a minor over a 6-year period, from age 11 to 17. This wasn't a case clouded by ambiguity or conflicting testimonies. There was an explicit, documented admission. Yet what followed was perhaps even more shocking than the crime itself. After a suspension lasting merely 11 months, Hall was reinstated into religious activities at a different congregation, continuing as though nothing had occurred. The Guardian, one of the world's most credible news outlets, reported extensively on this case, sending shockwaves through both victim advocacy communities and members questioning the organization's internal justice procedures. Also in 2025, authorities in Westmoreland County, Pennsylvania, filed charges against a man accused of abusing 2 children between 1989 and 1997. This case represents just one piece of a massive investigative puzzle assembled by Pennsylvania's Attorney General, systematically examining multiple Jehovah's Witness congregations throughout the state. Investigators uncovered a recurring pattern: historical complaints that were minimized, handled internally with inadequate procedures, or managed in ways that prioritized institutional protection over victim welfare. In Fort Kent, Maine, a courageous woman publicly shared her harrowing experience of being sexually abused by congregation elders when she was only 6 years old during the 1990s. The most heartbreaking aspect of her story wasn't just the abuse itself, but the institutional response. When her family attempted to report internally, they faced threats and intimidation rather than support. Her suffering was dismissed, her voice silenced, and her faith weaponized as a control mechanism. Maine Public documented her testimony, giving it national visibility and validation. These 3 cases represent merely the visible tip of a much larger iceberg. Behind every headline exist dozens, perhaps hundreds of similar stories that never reached media outlets, resolved behind closed doors in internal judicial committees, or buried beneath layers of institutional silence and policies prioritizing organizational reputation above protecting the vulnerable. For many elders who have faithfully served for years, sometimes decades, within the decision-making and disciplinary structures of Jehovah's Witnesses, these revelations trigger more than mere disturbance. They catalyze existential crises. These men dedicated substantial portions of their lives to leading congregations, counseling families, administering spiritual justice according to organizational manuals. Now they face destabilizing questions. How can I continue leading something I'm beginning to see as fundamentally broken? How can I defend before my congregation an institution that has systematically failed to protect the innocent? How do I reconcile my conscience with policies I was trained to enforce? This is the context in which increasing numbers of elders across the United States are making the most difficult decision of their lives, resigning from leadership positions, questioning the organization they devoted their best years to, and in many cases, completely severing ties with Jehovah's Witnesses. In this investigative analysis, we'll explore 5 fundamental reasons why these elders are taking this radical step in 2025. These aren't theoretical speculations but real motivations documented through testimonies, interviews, resignation letters, and public statements from former elders who finally decided to speak out. 1. Shattered trust through abuse scandals and institutional cover-ups. Trust forms the foundational pillar upon which any religious institution is built. When believers turn to spiritual leaders, they expect moral guidance, protection, and safe spaces where vulnerabilities will be respected. For Jehovah's Witnesses, who consider themselves God's people separated from a corrupt world, this trust carries even greater weight. The organization constructed its identity on the premise of moral superiority, ethical purity, and spiritual distinction from other religions. However, when an administrator like Joseph Fitzgerald Hall formally confesses to sexually abusing a minor over 6 consecutive years and, despite this explicit confession, returns to religious activities following a suspension of less than 12 months, something fundamental fractures in the community's moral fabric. Elders who served on judicial committees, who applied severe disciplines for offenses considered minor by organizational standards, such as smoking, viewing pornography, or dating outside the religion, now process unbearable moral dissonance. How is it possible that someone who committed such a grievous crime, who destroyed a child's innocence over years, could be restored so quickly? Why do internal policies appear more lenient toward confessed abusers than toward young people who simply questioned a doctrine? This inconsistency doesn't go unnoticed. Veteran elders remember cases where congregation members were disfellowshipped, excommunicated, for significantly lesser offenses, separated from families, shunned by entire communities, treated as living dead within their own social circles. The contrast is devastating. But the erosion of trust extends beyond individual cases. Systematic patterns of cover-up reveal something deeper and more disturbing: an institutional culture prioritizing the organization's public image over justice for victims. Investigations in Pennsylvania and other states have documented how internal policies of Jehovah's Witnesses include specific directives limiting disclosure of abuse to civil authorities. One of the most controversial policies is the so-called two-witness rule, derived from literal interpretation of biblical passages. According to this rule, allegations of sexual abuse cannot be processed internally unless two eyewitnesses to the act exist. This policy, theoretically designed to protect against false accusations, practically creates an almost impenetrable shield for abusers, since the vast majority of sexual abuse occurs privately, without witnesses. Victims attempting to report are frequently dismissed, discredited, or instructed to wait on Jehovah for justice. Elders who participated in applying these policies for years now face painful revelation. They were unwitting accomplices in a system protecting perpetrators. Many acted in good faith, sincerely believing they followed biblical guidelines. But when accumulated cases reach public light, when adult victims finally testify about decades of silent suffering, when investigative journalists document cover-up patterns extending nationally and internationally, denial becomes impossible. The credibility loss is total. Elders who previously defended the organization fervently against external critics, who rejected as apostate propaganda any accusation of mishandling abuse cases, now find themselves without arguments. The facts are public, verifiable, undeniable. And this generates institutional identity crisis. If the organization presenting itself as God's sole communication channel with humanity commits moral errors of this magnitude, what does that say about its supposed divine authority? For many elders, this trust breakdown is the first domino falling in a series of questions that will eventually lead them to abandon not only their leadership position but the organization itself. 2. Conscience conflicts and doctrinal dissonance. Being an elder among Jehovah's Witnesses isn't simply occupying an honorary position. It's a responsibility requiring strict adherence to a body of doctrines, policies, and procedures constantly established and updated by the governing body at New York headquarters. Elders are trained to apply these directives without question, trusting they represent divine will transmitted through the faithful and discreet slave, as the organization designates its central leadership. However, throughout years of service, some elders begin experiencing a profoundly destabilizing psychological phenomenon known as cognitive dissonance. This occurs when what they're expected to believe, teach, and apply directly conflicts with what they observe, experience, or conclude through their own moral reasoning. A clear example is the disfellowshipping or expulsion policy. Elders are trained to form judicial committees determining whether a member should be expelled from the congregation. Once expelled, that individual must be completely shunned by all Jehovah's Witnesses, including their own family members. Not even cordial greetings are permitted. The theological justification is that this practice protects the congregation from spiritual contamination and motivates the expelled to repent and return. But some elders, after applying this discipline for years, begin seeing its devastating effects on families. They witness parents unable to speak with their children. They see adult children losing all contact with aging parents. They see destroyed marriages. They observe people falling into severe depression, paralyzing anxiety, even suicidal tendencies resulting from total ostracism. And the question begins emerging in their minds: is this really what a loving God would command? Is this practice consistent with the compassionate message Jesus taught? Another area of doctrinal conflict emerges around prophecies and chronological teachings. Jehovah's Witnesses have a long history of failed prophetic predictions. Specific dates were established for the world's end: 1914, 1925, 1975, and more recently the generation that saw 1914, which according to updated teachings now extends in increasingly elastic ways. Veteran elders remember these predictions. Many lived through fervent expectations and massive disappointments when dates arrived and passed without apocalyptic events. Over time, some elders begin investigating the organization's history more deeply. They discover many doctrines presented today as established truth were radically different teachings in the past. They discover the organization changed its position on fundamental topics multiple times, sometimes returning to previously discarded positions. This generates an inevitable question. If these doctrines are truly progressive divine revelations, why are there so many contradictions and reversals? Dissonance intensifies when these elders must discipline members for questioning doctrines they themselves find problematic. Imagine being an elder with private doubts about the 1914 teaching as the date of kingdom establishment in heaven, then having to serve on a judicial committee to expel a young person who publicly expressed those same doubts. The psychological weight of this forced hypocrisy is overwhelming. Additionally, ethical dilemmas exist around medical policies. The organization strictly prohibits blood transfusions, considering them a violation of the biblical command to abstain from blood. Elders are trained to visit hospitals and ensure members comply with this directive, even in life-or-death situations. They've seen children die from lack of transfusions. They've consoled devastated parents who chose religious obedience over their children's lives. And some elders begin wondering, is this interpretation really the only possible one? Is it worth dying for a specific interpretation of a biblical verse when equally valid alternative exegetically arguments exist? Conscience conflicts also arise in everyday pastoral situations. An elder might be counseling a woman being physically abused by her witness husband. According to organizational guidelines, divorce is only permitted in cases of adultery. Domestic violence isn't considered grounds for divorce with freedom to remarry. The elder finds himself in an impossible position. Applying official policy would mean telling this woman she must remain in a dangerous situation, or separate but live in forced celibacy the rest of her life. His conscience tells him this is unjust, potentially dangerous, and morally questionable. But his position as elder requires applying policy without deviation. These conflicts accumulate over years. Each difficult case, each situation where strict rule application produces evident suffering, each moment where the elder must suppress his own doubts to maintain appearance of absolute certainty, adds another layer of internal tension. Eventually, for some, the pressure becomes unsustainable. The dissonance between what they must teach and what they actually believe, between what they must apply and what their conscience tells them is right, becomes too heavy a burden to carry. And when this dissonance reaches its critical point, the elder finds himself at a crossroads. Continue living a lie, suppressing his true thoughts and feelings, or have the courage to acknowledge he can no longer in good conscience continue in this position. 3. Spiritual and emotional overload. The burnout of shepherds without their own flock. The role of an elder among Jehovah's Witnesses is, in many ways, equivalent to being a pastor, counselor, administrator, mediator, and community leader, all condensed into one person. And all of this is expected to be done voluntarily, without financial compensation, while maintaining secular employment to support themselves and their families. The practical burden is immense. Elders are responsible for preparing and delivering public talks, conducting Bible studies, supervising preaching work in assigned territories, organizing service meetings, attending pastoral emergencies at any hour, visiting sick or spiritually weak members, and participating in judicial committees that may extend through multiple sessions of several hours each. But beyond practical responsibilities exists an emotional and psychological burden rarely discussed openly. Elders are the people members turn to in their worst moments. Marital crises, secret addictions, severe depression, suicidal thoughts, confessions of sins carried for years. They're the ones who must sit with parents who just lost a child. They're the ones who must mediate devastating family conflicts. They're the ones who must decide if a person will be disfellowshipped, knowing that decision could result in losing all significant relationships. This constant exposure to pain, conflict, and crisis has cumulative effects. Psychologists studying religious leaders have identified a phenomenon called compassion fatigue, or vicarious trauma. It's the emotional exhaustion resulting from continuously absorbing others' suffering without adequate spaces to process that emotional weight. For Jehovah's Witness elders, this problem magnifies because they lack access to professional support resources. There are no trained counselors they can turn to, no psychological supervision, no wellness programs for religious leaders. They're expected to depend exclusively on prayer, Bible study, and faith to manage burdens that would break trained mental health professionals. Additionally, there exists cultural expectation within the organization that elders must be models of perfect spiritual stability. They cannot show weakness, cannot admit doubts, cannot say, "I can't do this anymore," without risking their reputation and position. This mask of invulnerability creates enormous psychological pressure. Many elders develop what therapists call emotional double life, projecting confidence and control publicly while internally struggling with anxiety, exhaustion, and hopelessness. The resulting burnout has physical and psychological manifestations: chronic insomnia, panic attacks, hypertension, ulcers, clinical depression. Many elders reach a point where their mental and physical health is seriously compromised by the weight of their responsibilities. And here emerges a cruel paradox. When an elder finally recognizes he's exhausted and needs rest, organizational culture tends to interpret this as lack of faith or spiritual weakness. Instead of receiving support and understanding, he may face scrutiny and judgment. Why aren't you trusting in Jehovah? Why aren't you praying enough? Is there some secret sin weakening you spiritually? This lack of space for human vulnerability creates a psychological trap. The elders who most need help are precisely those who can least ask for it without risking their position and reputation. For some, the breaking point arrives when they realize they're sacrificing their own mental health, their marriages, their relationships with their children, their physical well-being, all in service of an organization that doesn't adequately recognize or value that sacrifice. They ask themselves, is this cost worth it? Is this really what God expects from me? Or am I being exploited by an organizational structure consuming its volunteer leaders without reciprocity? When these questions begin arising in combination with the doctrinal doubts and institutional trust breakdown mentioned earlier, the complete picture becomes clear. They're not only mentally and emotionally exhausted, but exhausted in service of something they're no longer certain deserves that sacrifice. 4. Legal risk, public visibility, and personal accountability. A dimension that has emerged with particular force in recent years is the growing legal exposure of elders as individuals, not just as organizational representatives. This is a reality many elders never anticipated when accepting their appointment, but which has now become a central concern for those considering their future in the organization. State and federal investigations into religious organizations' handling of sexual abuse cases have placed Jehovah's Witnesses under unprecedented legal scrutiny. Pennsylvania Attorney General's investigation is just one example. California, New York, and other states have initiated similar investigations or modified laws to allow historical abuse victims to file civil lawsuits against institutions and individuals who participated in cover-ups. Here's the crucial aspect generating anxiety among elders. In many jurisdictions, elders who served on judicial committees that inadequately handled abuse allegations can be held personally liable. It's not just the organization that can be sued, it's them as individuals who may face legal and financial consequences. Imagine being an elder who, 15 years ago, participated in a judicial committee evaluating sexual abuse allegations against another congregation member. At that time, he followed guidelines taught to him, applied the two-witness rule, determined insufficient evidence to proceed, and didn't report the case to civil authorities because organizational policy then actively discouraged doing so. He acted in good faith, believing he followed appropriate biblical procedures. Now, in 2025, that victim has reached adulthood and decided to file a civil lawsuit. Laws have changed. Statute of limitations windows have extended or been eliminated. And that elder receives a court summons naming him personally as defendant. He didn't abuse anyone, but he's being accused of negligence, participating in cover-up, violating his duty of care toward a vulnerable minor. This prospect is terrifying. Elders who thought they were serving God now face the possibility of losing their savings, their homes, their public reputation, facing costly and prolonged trials, and potentially being found liable for civil damages reaching 6 or 7 figures. And here's the additional dilemma. The Jehovah's Witnesses organization has been historically ambiguous about the degree to which it will legally protect individual elders in these situations. While it provides some legal guidance and, in certain cases, legal assistance, there's no absolute guarantee the organization will assume all defense costs or indemnifications if an elder is found liable. Some elders who have faced lawsuits discovered they're essentially alone, defending themselves with their own financial resources. This legal vulnerability is generating a chilling effect. Actively serving elders are increasingly reluctant to participate in judicial committees, especially those involving abuse allegations. Some are meticulously documenting every decision, every statement, every procedure, not for spiritual reasons but for legal protection. They're consulting with personal attorneys before participating in certain cases. They're, in effect, operating with a legal protection mentality fundamentally incompatible with the pastoral role they're supposed to fulfill. Furthermore, public visibility of high-profile cases has introduced another risk dimension: reputational exposure. In the era of social media and digital investigative journalism, names of elders who participated in mishandling abuse cases are being published online. Activists and survivor groups have created public databases documenting names, congregations, and details of mishandled cases. For elders working in professional sectors where reputation is crucial, education, healthcare, financial services, law, this public exposure can have devastating career consequences. Employers have terminated contracts. Clients have withdrawn business. Neighbors have changed attitudes. The reputational stain transcends the religious sphere and contaminates all aspects of their lives. Facing this reality, some elders are making the pragmatic decision to preventively resign from their positions before problematic cases arise that could involve them legally. Others already implicated in investigations or lawsuits are completely reevaluating their relationship with the organization, asking, "Why should I continue risking my financial and legal well-being for an institution that not only doesn't adequately protect me but put me in this vulnerable position through defective policies?" 5. Internal misalignment and the unsustainability of double life. Of all the reasons we're exploring, this is perhaps the most existentially anguishing and personally devastating. It's the moment when an elder looks in the mirror and recognizes that the person he projects publicly no longer matches who he is internally. It's the fracture between the public self, the confident spiritual leader, the assured doctrine teacher, the unwavering organizational defender, and the private self, the skeptic, the doubter, the morally conflicted, the spiritually exhausted. This double life can be maintained for months, even years. The elder learns to compartmentalize. When he ascends the platform to give a talk, he activates his public mode and presents teachings with expected conviction, though internally harboring profound doubts about those same teachings. When participating in elders' meetings, he nods and votes on decisions that morally discomfort him, because he cannot express dissent without risking his position. When counseling members, he repeats programmed responses given hundreds of times, though his heart tells him the situation requires more nuanced response. But maintaining this duality has tremendous psychological cost. Psychologists describe it as identity dissonance, a form of stress arising when our actions profoundly contradict our genuine values and beliefs. And this stress doesn't simply remain stable. It intensifies over time, especially when situations accumulate where the gap between what the elder must say and what he actually believes grows increasingly wide. Some elders in this situation describe a sensation of living as actors on a stage, reciting lines from a script they no longer consider true. They describe the fatigue of constantly censoring their real thoughts, of measuring every word in conversations with other elders or congregation members for fear of revealing doubts. They describe the isolation of being unable to be authentic with anyone, neither with the congregation, where they must maintain their faithful leader mask, nor with their families, where expressing doubts could create marital crises or alarm their children. This double life has concrete manifestations. An elder might be delivering a talk about the importance of trusting the organization while simultaneously researching online testimonies from ex-witnesses and academic criticisms. He might be participating in a service meeting encouraging publishers to be zealous in preaching while he himself has stopped believing the message they preach is true. He might be counseling a young person not to attend university because the end is near, while internally thinking that advice is harmful and robbing that person of life opportunities. The unsustainability of this situation eventually reaches a critical point. And that critical point can be triggered by various factors. For some, it's a particular event, like having to disfellowship someone they personally believe doesn't deserve that punishment. For others, it's gradual, a cumulative weight of small hypocrisies that finally becomes intolerable. For some, it's a mental health crisis, severe anxiety, clinical depression, even suicidal thoughts generated by unsustainable internal tension. When the elder finally recognizes he cannot continue living this double life, he faces extremely difficult options. He might attempt to express doubts gradually, hoping to find space for honest dialogue. But Jehovah's Witnesses' organizational culture doesn't tolerate doctrinal dissent, especially not from leaders. Openly expressing doubts typically results in removal from position, being marked apostate, and potentially being disfellowshipped. He might attempt simply resigning from elder position without detailed explanations, citing personal or health reasons. This can work in some cases, allowing him to remain in the organization as regular member without leadership responsibilities. But even this generates questions and suspicion in the congregation. Or he can take the most radical decision, make a clean exit, resigning not only from elder position but from complete organizational membership. This option comes with highest cost, losing all relationships within the religion, potentially including close family, lifelong friends, entire social community. It's voluntary social death, but it's the price some conclude they must pay to recover personal integrity and live authentically. What makes this situation particularly painful is that many of these elders are men of deep moral sincerity. They didn't become elders for ambition or power. They did so because they genuinely wanted to serve, help, guide, and care for their faith community. Their internal misalignment isn't the result of malice or calculated hypocrisy but of awakening conscience, of intellectual and moral growth that led them to conclusions simply incompatible with continuing in their role. And when they finally make the decision to stop living the lie, when they choose authenticity over social convenience, when they prioritize personal integrity over institutional position, they're demonstrating a type of moral courage that is profoundly admirable, even if painful. These 5 interconnected reasons driving increasing numbers of elders to leave Jehovah's Witnesses in America during 2025 reveal a striking pattern. We're not witnessing individual faith crises or isolated discontent cases. We're observing a systemic institutional crisis whose cracks are becoming impossible to conceal or deny. The trust breakdown caused by sexual abuse scandals and mishandling isn't a public relations problem manageable through carefully worded official statements. It's a fundamental moral problem revealing flaws in policies, organizational culture, and operational values. When a religious organization systematically prioritizes reputation over protecting vulnerable children, it has forfeited moral authority regardless of biblical verses cited to justify actions. The conscience conflicts and doctrinal dissonance these elders experience aren't results of spiritual weakness or faith lack. They're natural products of critical thinking applied to doctrines and practices that, under honest scrutiny, show inconsistencies, historical contradictions, and harmful human consequences. When intelligent and morally sensitive leaders are expected to suppress legitimate doubts and apply policies violating their conscience, an unsustainable tension is created that must eventually resolve, either toward personal integrity or institutional conformity. The spiritual and emotional overload these men experience results predictably from a system extracting intensive pastoral labor without providing adequate psychological support, without permitting human vulnerability, and without recognizing limits of what unpaid volunteers can reasonably sustain long-term. The culture of spiritual invulnerability the organization promotes isn't just unrealistic, it's psychologically destructive. Emerging legal risk represents significant evolution in institutional accountability dynamics. Elders are discovering that following orders or applying organizational policy aren't sufficient legal defenses when those policies result in harm to minors. This reality is forcing fundamental reevaluation of what accepting leadership positions in organizational structures means. And finally, the unsustainability of living double lives, maintaining public facades contradicting internal reality, represents perhaps the highest personal cost. It's the price of authenticity sacrificed on the altar of institutional conformity. For growing numbers of elders, that price has simply become too high to continue paying. What we're witnessing isn't simply discontented individuals abandoning a religion. It's a collective awakening process among those most deeply integrated into power and decision-making structures. These men saw how the sausage was made. They participated in internal processes. They applied policies. They saw results. And significant numbers have concluded the system is fundamentally broken in ways that cannot be reformed from within. Their departures represent more than statistical losses. They represent erosion of social and moral capital maintaining any institution's cohesion. When middle-level leaders, those interacting daily with ordinary members, who know ground-level realities, who implement central leadership policies, begin disconnecting en masse, it signals that the gap between official institutional narrative and experienced reality has become unsustainable. For victims of abuse trying to be heard for years or decades, these elder departures represent bitter but significant validation. Their testimonies, dismissed or ignored for so long, are finally being recognized as true, not just by external observers but by those who were inside the system. And for those still within the organization facing similar struggles, these stories serve as testaments that choosing authenticity is possible, though difficult. The path forward for these former elders isn't easy. Rebuilding identities outside structures that defined their lives for decades, reconnecting with separated families, processing trauma from years of cognitive dissonance, and finding new belonging communities, all require time, support, and extraordinary resilience. But in their departures also exists hope that critical thinking, moral conscience, and personal integrity can prevail even against massive institutional pressures. Hope that it's not too late to choose authenticity. And hope that by speaking out, they're helping others find courage to make their own honest evaluations and informed decisions.